We've read the scriptures together earlier in our service, Matthew 5, 38 through 42. I'm not going to read them again, but I want you to use your Bible, turn to them, look at them again. I want you to be familiar with this command of Christ, which I've summarized as simply go the second mile. When I was serving in Artesia at the church that I helped start down there, I found myself talking to someone about their faith in Christ and why they no longer wanted to attend a church. She worked for a business in town, and her boss, who was also the owner of the store, was very involved in his church. He spoke to each of his employees about his faith, including her. He talked about the events that they held at their church and invited them to things that their church was sponsoring, even things like Thanksgiving dinners and concerts, and seeming like pretty cool events. But she reiterated to me that she was simply not interested in going to church. And if she ever did change her mind about it, she would never go to her boss's church. So I asked her why. And she told me how she and his other employees were treated on a daily basis. And how the other employees had been entreated by him, especially whenever he got upset, which he did pretty frequently. And when he did, it was never a pretty sight. She said that she worked with some non-Christians in town who had treated her a whole lot better. And she was already looking for another job because of the way she was being treated. But because this was back when the oil industry was busting instead of booming, jobs were kind of scarce. So she took what she could get, and she simply had to just put up with it. We agreed that if someone was really following Jesus, they would, or at least they should, act better than those who are not following Jesus. They should show a little more kindness, express a little more compassion, and when they dealt with the frustrations of even running a small business, they should deal with their daily trials with more grace, with more generosity. She confided in me that if she were ever to get a job with a Christian who ran their business more like that, she might consider their invitation if one were given to visit their church. But as things were, she was simply not interested. She did indicate, however, that she would be interested in being part of a church that was really known for their love, that really had people who acted like this, but she expressed her skepticism that something like that really existed. She'd been to some and hadn't found them that way. So I want you to ask yourself, what changes would have had to happen between that employee and their boss for her to get to the point that she would accept his next invitation to church? Jesus would say that there would need to be repentance and forgiveness between the two. But he also might say it might be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than that to happen. As we begin our study of Jesus' command to turn the other cheek and to go the second mile, let's remember that Jesus wants us to live in such a way that any and every interaction we have with another person will influence them to take another step closer toward God rather than moving further away from Him. So let's begin our study by letting the background for Jesus' command come forward by asking this question. What sort of community problems would arise if there were no law and no justice regarding that law? What sort of community problems would we experience if no one stood up for the helpless or cared for the least of these? What would happen in that community if no one was held accountable for their bad behavior, whether it was done intentionally or not? The law of Moses, as detailed in the book of Deuteronomy, was meant to establish God's way for God's people to treat one another, especially when they had disputes between each other. In their communities, because they used God's law and administered His justice, those who were injured or hurt or had been taken advantage of in some way could turn to their leaders for help. And they could be confident that things would be made right. And while the individuals involved were free to get together on their own and maybe agree to a more gracious settlement, that option would be taken off the table if they decided to settle their dispute in court, that is, go before their leaders. In their courts, they could expect a much stricter justice. Some might say a much harsher justice to be carried out. If found guilty, the perpetrator would receive upon themselves what they had done to their victims, no questions asked. If the victim had been hit and a bone broken, then the perpetrator would have their bone broken. If property had been stolen or damaged, its replacement or its value would be repaid, and sometimes double. If death resulted, then their life would be taken. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was meant to establish justice, to return peace between the disputing parties. It was not a reformative justice system which has made the headlines in our country recently. But it was believed that when strictly adhered to, the Mosaic legal system would discourage bad behavior and it would promote good behavior. That is, if you knew that there would be no grace if you were found guilty, you might be more careful. Even so, the whole goal of the Mosaic legal system was to bring justice to the victim and, if possible, peace between those disputing parties. In Jesus' day, things were a little more complicated because they did not just live under the Mosaic law, they also had to live under Roman law, which allowed behavior that the Mosaic law didn't permit. Under Roman law, those in authority were allowed to strike those under their authority when they were displeased with them. It was perfectly legal to do. But that was not allowed under the Mosaic law. When Jesus spoke of an evil man who did such things, he used a word that's translated evil that describes a person who did not do what a righteous man would do. And a righteous man was someone who did things God's way, someone who lived according to the law of Moses, despite what the Roman law would allow or not. So a Judean, which is who Jesus was speaking to at the time, could act within the bonds of the Roman law. They could slap someone under their authority. In doing so, they would be viewed as being evil because what they did was not what God would have wanted them to do. And in Galilee, where Jesus was at the time, the people were heavily influenced by Roman ways. They'd already adopted their tracking of time. Romanisms were creeping into their culture. They were adopting more of the Roman ways than they realized, and it was already at work in how they were treating one another. That's why Jesus once told a group of Pharisees this idea of being evil even though you think you're God's people. He says, you can just tell a fruit. A tree is either good or bad by its fruit. And then he immediately said to the same group, how can you, being evil, speak what is good? For out of the mouth it's filled by what flows from the heart. That's Matthew 12, 33 and 34. They may have been religious leaders who would have known God's ways, but they were not acting and speaking as God desired, and so Jesus would have considered them evil. Makes you wonder if he might consider you evil. Also, under Roman law, soldiers were permitted to conscript anyone nearby to carry their gear 1 mile without compensation. Again, that's not something that's allowed under the Mosaic law. But litigation over small claims was allowed under the Mosaic law, which was often done in Jesus' day. Most small claims could be settled outside of court. But if you're really not interested in establishing peace with the other person, you could insist on going to court where you could legally take the shirt off of another man's back. which doesn't sound like the sort of thing that God would want anyone to do. The Mosaic laws also regulated when, to whom, and how much a person was required to give to those seeking financial help, whether they wanted to borrow money to get by or whether they just simply needed a handout. And at that time, these Mosaic laws were used by some to avoid acts of compassion and generosity. You can just hear them say, well, I'd really like to help. I mean, I really would, but you know, the law, it won't allow me to make that sort of a loan with money. I'm under obligation to God, and under these circumstances, I can't help. Or, you know, I'd really like to help, but, you know, I've already given my alms at the temple to help take care of the poor, and you'll just need to go there for help. And you can also imagine how those who needed that help would be angered by those who were turning them away and not showing that extra mile of generosity. Between the Roman laws and how the Mosaic laws were being used, justice was often averted instead of being established, and peace was seldom restored between those in a dispute. That's part of the reason why they longed for God to send the promised Prince of Peace, who they believed would establish a society in which life, because it would be administered God's way, would be so much better than what they were experiencing. Now, as I said earlier, the underlying issue that Jesus was addressing with this command to go the second mile was how one's response toward another person can either move them toward or away from God. Anger, resentment, claiming one's right can often push people away from God, while unexpected acts of grace and generosity can nudge them, push them toward Him. So let's take a little closer look at Jesus' example of this when He spoke about turning the other cheek. We need to remember that first century context that Jesus was addressing. You would be the underling who was struck by a displeased master. What do? Probably you were struck unfairly, unjustly, without cause. You could immediately defend yourself, even striking them back, returning to them that eye for an eye. And if they complained about it or made a fuss about it, you could take them to your leaders, to the court, to those who use the Mosaic law and make your case. But even if they agreed with you and you were justified in your action, that master might take you to the Roman court where you would be found guilty and punished because it was legal under Roman law. Or you could, as Jesus advocated, turn the other cheek. Your master would also be one of God's people. He'd be Jewish as well as you, which meant that he would also know that the way he was treating you wasn't the way God would want him to treat you, even if it was legal Romanly. Because of his behavior, his striking you, he would fit into Jesus' definition of being an evil man, one who was not living by God's law. In turning the other cheek, instead of immediately getting in his face about it, you would be giving him an opportunity to move back towards God's way. In turning the other cheek, you would be offering him a measure of grace, offering him something that he did not deserve. In turning the other cheek, you would be giving him an opportunity to admit that what he just did was wrong. And you would give him the opportunity to seek forgiveness for it. I don't think that Jesus, in commanding us to turn the other cheek, was requiring us to stay in an abusive relationship. That's not what he was talking about at all. But he was advocating that we handle evil behavior in a way, even being slapped in the face, with grace that gives the opportunity for someone who's doing the wrong thing to stop and respond. And we should also express the same sort of demeanor if someone were to take you to a small claims court. In this example, you are the accused. Someone thinks that you owe them compensation for something that you borrowed and didn't return, or didn't return in good condition, but you obviously don't feel the same way, or you wouldn't be headed to small claims court. You feel that you did return it in good condition, or at least good enough condition, or that the damage that was resulted wasn't really your fault at all. Maybe the item was old and was just worn out to start with, and you didn't feel like it was your obligation to make it right. You can't settle the dispute. So you're going to court to let those that are your leaders to settle it for you. If found guilty, it'll be that Mosaic law. You'll have to pay back the replacement eye for eye, tooth for tooth, value for value. And if you don't have the money to pay it back, you'll owe the debt. And they will hold you in prison until your family or your friends pay back that debt. And in order to raise the funds, even your clothing, which was valuable back then, could be taken as part of the payment of the debt that you owed. And yes, your outer garment would be much more of value than your inner one. But on the way to court, there would still be an opportunity for you to settle things differently. You could even then, and even though you may be in the right, offer them twice what they would get in court from you. It was evidently a very small claim, otherwise your inner shirt would not be enough to pay the debt. Jesus was advocating that instead of insisting on your rights, instead of making this thing about principle, that you give your accuser more than what they owe, even if they are the ones who are not in the right, gracing them. What would your accuser think if you were to make such a generous offer? Especially if he knew that you were really in the right and they were in the wrong, but also knew that the court would likely side with them. Would your generosity nudge them toward God or away from God? Jesus seems to think that it would nudge them toward God. If you showed them that extra mile of generosity, if you would offer them not just your inner shirt, but your outer one as well, even though they didn't deserve it. It might prick their conscience where God could be at work. And what would a Roman soldier think of you if instead of complaining about having to take their stuff 1 mile and murmuring all the way under your breath how much you hate them and hate the Romans and this is unfair, and if anything, he'd at least compensate you, and actually decided to help them, to walk along and maybe talking their ear off like Paul did his prison guards, not for just 1 mile, but for 2. That time you spent with them might be the opportunity to share something good with them about the God of grace and mercy and love to a person whose life wasn't so wonderful. You have to remember that Roman soldiers had a pretty tough life. It was a difficult life. And because they were looking for something better, they might be open to that message of grace. They would probably be impressed that you were showing them a rather different attitude than they encountered anywhere else, and it really would nudge them maybe to consider God in a new way. It might even open a door for later for them to move toward Him, even though they were Roman. Sometimes expressions of grace are good. I remember a number of years ago going down to visit my son, and we went into a Walmart, and he picked up some, I don't know what they were. They were those like little Debbie's or something like that, those secret pleasures, and I looked at them, I was like, oh, that's great. You know, we're going to have those at home, and I'm going to get to eat those things, and we go up to the base, because he was on base at the time, and the guards came out, they checked the passages, and he took that and he just handed it to them and hoped that they had a nice day, and then we went on through. I was like, dang. And he just looked at me and he said, those guys have such a miserable job. I just want to bring a little grace to them. An unexpected pleasure. Man, pride. And what of those who are in need? And they're seeking from you alone some financial assistance. You could disregard them while keeping the strictest interpretation of the law of Moses and thinking well of yourself. You could be a little more gracious. You could give from the abundance that God has given you in your life. In fact, you don't have anything that God hasn't given you. You could be gracious like He is, looking a little more like your Father in heaven. And generosity always nudges people toward God, especially those who don't think that God cares about them or their needs. And let me tell you, a lot of needy people think that God doesn't care. And they're surprised whenever His feet and His hands show up, when you show up. But that was back then, right? What about now? I mean, does grace and generosity really nudge people toward God? I'm going to ask the worship team to start making their way up here, and I'll warn you, you're going to be up here for a little bit. At ICOM last week, ICOM is the International Conference on Missions, which you sent me to, whether you realize it or not, and I want to thank you for sending me there. One of the speakers shared his story about being raised a Muslim. He told me at the time when he was a boy in the small village where he lived at, that another boy showed up at their school who was not a Muslim. This was very, very unusual in their little community. He was only in 5th grade. After school, he and his friends caught this boy on his way home, and they laid into him. They beat him severely. They thought that they had killed him, and they had hoped that they had. There was no remorse in them because they felt that Allah was pleased with them for punishing someone, the infidel, as they had done. And they would be rewarded for their behavior. That boy never came back to school, and he and his friends were happy about it. By the time he got into high school, he had studied enough to realize that his faith had no real answers for what was going to happen to him after death, because he was far from perfect and he could find nothing about grace, forgiveness. And it was then that he began to wonder about what the Bible had to say about God's forgiveness of those who have done wrong, because he had and heard rumors about it. But he didn't really know what the Bible actually said. It was while seeking answers to that question that someone ended up giving him a Bible, and he took it home to his house. He thought he'd done so secretly, but someone had seen and found out. His neighbors came, and they demanded that he give it up. Even his dad came to him and told him to bring it out and to hand it over to the crowd that was gathering at their house. But he refused to do so, not because he knew what the Bible had to say, but because he just wanted to learn what it might say. He was thrown out of his house for refusing to give it up after several attempts to change his mind. And when his father finally threw him out of the house, he was told to never, ever come back to the house, never come back to their village. And within a week, his family held a funeral for him. They had a casket, they put things in it that belonged to him, they took it to the cemetery just outside of their village, they buried it, and they put a tombstone in it. He cried when he told the story. I might too. He said last time he was in his hometown, he was at the cemetery looking at his own grave with his name on it. And he knew that his life with his family in that community was over. he left. Didn't know where to go. He went to a nearby village, and he just happened to run into a Christian family, and they took him into their home. And by the time he went to his first service, because he had learned enough about the Bible by then that he wanted to know more, he went to that first service, and when he got there, he saw the boy that he and his friends had beaten up and left for dead. The boy recognized him too. So the boy stood up with some urgency, made a straight line toward him, and he didn't know what he was going to do. So the boy came up and just looked him in the eyes, and then embraced him, and told him, "I'm so glad you're here. I want you to know I forgave you, and I forgave your friends a long time ago." That embrace of grace, rather than a demand for justice, provided that nudge he needed to take another step toward God, the God of the Bible. He would become a Christian, a follower of Jesus, because he wanted to live that way. He wanted the hope that they held. He would become a leader in a church, or he would have been speaking at the conference. He did become a missionary to Muslims, because he knew that there were a lot of people there that God loved, and they needed the grace that he experienced. And he has led many people to faith in Christ. But the real question is, what about us? What about you? Does your grace and your generosity under fire drive people toward God? Or are you acting in ways that drive them further away, demanding on justice and your rights? As we sing this last song together, commit yourself to learning and following all of the commands of Christ. And as we do, we will become a church that is known by our love. Would you please stand?